probably don't recognize these guys on the screen behind me. They were neighbors during the Civil War, but their families were anything but civil to one another. 13 years after the war ended, their hostilities came to a head. The focus of the argument was ownership of a hog. Both Floyd Hatfield and Randolph McCoy claimed the hog was theirs, and they took the matter to court. Testimony from a relative of both men, Bill Slayton, decided the case, and the portly bacon mater was awarded to the Hatfields. It would start a feud that would unleash a series of aggressions on both sides, making it one of the most famous feuds in history. Over 100 years after the fight started, descendants of both families appeared on the game show, Family Feud. The prize for the week-long battle? A hog. The Broadway play Hamilton has sparked historical interest across generations with its account of the life of Alexander Hamilton. And after the play gained a following, my household was filled with words and songs from the soundtrack, and they often still are. One of the songs is called the 10 Duel Commandments, a step-by-step singing of the rules of engagement when you've been disrespected and you must demand a duel so that matter is set. Duels were common in our early history as a country, and the duel portrayed actually happened between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. The final straw that led to the battle, a letter that Hamilton wrote that somehow got published in a newspaper discrediting Burr as untrustworthy to the American people, a letter that would cost Hamilton his life. And it's not just in our history. Retaliation between rivals is part of popular culture. Consider anti-heroes in the movie like John Wick, who sets himself on a path of revenge after his dog Daisy is killed by some bad guys. 4 movies later, John still isn't satisfied. It's only a movie, though. But what about when it's not history or a movie? What happens when it's someone that we know? What happens when the battle hits a little closer to home? Just a little while ago, 2 friends, 2 men of integrity entered into a duel settled that would figure out who could keep their composure and who could face adversity better, and their chosen weapon was a tortilla. The first blow was struck, then another returned back and forth, the tortilla challenge, but only one could claim victory, only one could gain satisfaction, back and forth, until the final blow is delivered. In every case, from the lighthearted to the starkness of our history as a nation, retaliation seems to be a means to an end where one side gets satisfaction, but almost always that satisfaction is temporary and fleeting. Retaliation gives way to further retaliation, and it often unleashes a never-ending cycle. It's been the cornerstone of the human condition seemingly forever. It was that way in Jesus' time as well. In fact, in part, it was the law. Today, we continue our series, You've Heard It Said, as we focus on 6 statements that Jesus made regarding the understood laws that people of faith live by. Statements that he started with the common refrain, you have heard it said. And to the crowd around Jesus, when he stated those laws, the people knew them. Pastor Bryan Hughes last week taught us that they would know those laws really well. And Pastor Bryan started our series by explaining how releasing anger towards others and doing whatever you can to make things right when someone is angry towards you, that releasing of anger would put you in a neutral position. One where releasing that anger could start to heal your heart and the heart of others. But what happens when it isn't just anger? What happens when it's aggression? When someone causes you harm or offense or tries to harm your character? As Jesus continues in his sermon, he arrives at another familiar law to his audience, and it goes like this. He says, you've heard it said, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. The people knew this law well. The eye for an eye, that law was passed down from generations to the people standing right there before Jesus that day. And you can find it in several places early on in the beginning of the Bible, but the book of Leviticus states it the clearest where it says this: anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted an injury must suffer the same injury. Now that sounds logical, I guess. It makes sense in the natural order of things. We know this law full well too, especially if you got siblings. Anybody got siblings out there? We got a few, right? As a kid growing up with my brother, this was our law. I remember so many times that justice was delivered in the backyard. If I pushed my brother Curtis, I expected him to return fire. I knew it was coming. If he took a swing at me, my natural posture was to swing back. And that's just the way it was. We often showed up to dinner with bruises, cuts, black eyes, but the dispute was settled. And on occasion, my dad would have to render a judgment. I remember for Christmas one year, we got these really cool dart guns. See, before Nerf was big, you got these dart guns with plastic darts with a suction cup on there. You remember those things? They fire about 1,400 feet per second. And the ones that we got had that same dart, but it had a plastic grenade on the end of it. And Dad's rule was this: the guns were to be fired at the targets provided, not each other. So with fingers crossed behind our backs, we swore Scouts honor, even though neither one of us were Scouts, that we would only shoot the targets. And we set up our battlefield. We fired on each other's position, destroying targets that we had set up. But as my brother saw the end of his defense nearing, he decided to storm my position, guns blazing. With a twinkle in my eye, I jumped up to meet him, loaded a plastic grenade, and fired that fateful shot, striking my brother right in the eye socket from about 5 feet away. What happened next was the trial of my young life. My brother ran to my dad. He fell along the way, holding his eye. Surely he was blinded for life. And I stood there, dropped my gun, and I waited for my fate. Maybe a spanking, or grounding, or confiscation of my weapon of choice. But it was none of the above. Instead, after the Inquisition and a reminder of the rule, my father rendered his verdict. He had some very interesting punishments, by the way. I would face the firing squad, a firing squad of one who had the right to shoot me with darts until one hit me in the eye. No joke. So I stood facing my brother with a pile of darts at his feet. Now, my brother's never been a really great shot, but I believe this day he was missing on purpose. I lost count of shots before I felt the sting of a plastic grenade collide with my eyelid. Justice had been served. And now our father had 2 sons with damaged corneas. And I was looking for the next opportunity to get my revenge, because that's the way backyard justice works. Dad's rule was broken, and it had consequences. He imposed the law to help us to avoid injuring each other, but I didn't follow the rule. This law in Leviticus is not just about a spat between 2 kids with darts in the backyard. There was a reason for it and a purpose for which God himself had handed it down. The spirit of the law so long ago was to bring order, to limit personal revenge, not encourage it. And this law was meant to be tried and heard, just like my dad's front porch court case. Facts had to be gathered. Additionally, though, the harsh tone of this law was meant to curb such crimes in the first place. But the letter of the law stated that it was the right of retaliation, pain for pain, injury for injury, life for life, that was the right of the offended person when judged by someone who was qualified to hear it. But the spirit of the law was that we should never arrive at personal injuries towards one another in the first place. But make no mistake, the consequences could be delivered. This same law in Deuteronomy says this: show no pity. Life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Show no pity. The offended person's right and the power of the judge was final and swift. Now, I'm not sure exactly how Jesus delivered his message that day, where he paused or reflected or gave the audience a chance to do that. I'm not even sure that he did. But at least some of those in the crowd had to have thought to themselves, an eye for an eye, that's justice as it should be. That's how we keep order. Maybe there were a few muted amens in the crowd. They knew punishment had to at least match the crime, and in that case, they should show no pity. But Jesus would not just let that be. He would ground them back to the spirit of law, but more than that, he would challenge them to align their hearts with God and turn their worlds upside down, and he's going to turn ours upside down too. Let's take a look at this as he continues. You've heard it said, that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. But I tell you, Jesus says. And when he says this, the crowd would lean in and pay attention. We should do that too. Jesus was about to challenge the letter of law, even the spirit of the law. It's important for the crowd that day. It's certainly important for us. So let's break this down, because there are 2 parts to this seemingly new command. In the first part, I want to reread it. I want to highlight it here so we can just take a look at it. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. What Jesus says feels a little outlandish to me. But even more so for the audience of that day. See, they were under the subject of harsh rule, a ruling government that was not kind to men, and it was often accompanied with physical force. But even more so, in Jewish society, not everyone was kind to the other. Not everyone was upright. Like today, some people chose to treat other people poorly. And a slap on the cheek, on your right cheek, it was actually delivered as a backhanded blow. It was an egregious insult, meant to show that you were inferior to the person who was delivering it to you. And being taken to court and sued, you could pay that debt with the shirt off your back. That was legal. You could literally lose your shirt. But your coat, your outer garment, no one could take that. The law actually said never take someone's coat overnight because they'll have nothing to sleep in. The coat was the most expensive piece of clothing a Jewish person would have. And Jesus was saying, give it up in addition to any debt that you owe. The people there, I promise you, a lot of them would have scoffed at what Jesus was saying. Did Jesus mean if we owed a debt that we should give up all our clothing and be naked? It was scandalous for him to say such things. But along with the 2 commands on how we respond to aggressor, he adds one more. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, then you should go 2 miles with them. It was common for Roman soldiers to grab those under their rule out of the crowd and force them to carry their packs for a mile. It was actually Roman law for them to do that. They imposed the same law on Simon of Cyrene as he carried Jesus' cross, as Pastor Ellis told us about in the Easter message. The law was on the side of the oppressor, but Jesus commanded to not only adhere to the law, but to double the distance asked, to go alongside those who sought to use you a little further. Acting on those commands seems counterintuitive, seems unnatural and self-deprecating. I mean, imagine with me just for a moment, that someone walks up to you as you leave today and they give you a backhanded slap on the cheek. I'm not talking about tortilla challenge here. I'm talking about a real slap. Would you not try to defend yourself? Wouldn't most of us at least take a stance to dodge the next shot or take a swing ourselves? That seems natural. But Jesus wasn't just talking about a slap in the face. He was also talking about insults, egregious insults. And we do get those hurled at us at times. In our age, there's so many ways to tell people that you don't like them. The internet has given us a new platform to take shots at other people, and it's out of control. And often nowadays that spills into our everyday life. It's not just a every now and then occurrence. How many times have you seen somebody, even in the last week, even in the last year, turn the other cheek? Let's be honest, not much. And what about the requirements of the law that Jesus talked about? If there was a ruling against one of us for $1,000, would we willingly give $2,000 just because? Or serve twice the sentence because it got handed down? That's a little far-fetched. But Jesus was not just talking about court. He was talking about making things right when you've done something wrong. He was saying you shouldn't only make amends, make it up to the person that you owe. Striving to be even with somebody is not the heart of God, and it's not the heart of Jesus. Going the extra mile, it meant it would cost you more than was required. And in every way, what Jesus commanded would cost you more insult, more investment, and possibly more indignity. But Jesus continued his command with two additional statements that seem different from the first three, but they complete the teaching that Jesus was delivering. So let's look at those two. He says, give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. In my role as do-good pastor at our church, I'm responsible for leading our efforts as a church as a gathering of Christ followers to go beyond ourselves and serve those who are in need in our communities and around our country and across borders in 3 different countries around the world. And that role often puts me and our wonderful group of volunteers and missionaries in a position to give to anyone who asks, to not turn away anyone who needs something from us. See, for us, it's not just a value on paper. Doing good is at the core of our entire church. With our Beyond initiative, our whole church committed to go beyond ourselves to do good. You know, as part of that, I recently traveled nearly 5,000 miles in 2 weeks, along with teams from PCC, helping our neighbors here in the U.S. and in Belize. Our church is living out the spirit of generosity that God calls us to. So when we think about these 5 things that Jesus talks about, let's put them all together and just walk through the commands. He starts by saying, don't resist an evil person. And he doesn't really qualify that. So can we all agree that that's just a person who has some type of aggression towards us? Let me clarify this, though. Jesus is not saying that we should ignore evil or the devil or injustice in the world or anything like that. He's just talking that this is a person who has greatly hurt us or offended us. This statement is more of a level of personal attack. In other places in the Bible, followers of Jesus would kind of restate what Jesus implied. Paul, an earlier follower of Jesus, wrote to a letter to Thessalonica. He wrote it like this. He said, make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Don't retaliate. Slap for slap gets you nowhere. If you've been found guilty, go above and beyond to make amends. If you're required to do service, go the extra mile. Be willing to be generous to anyone who is in need or someone who needs to borrow from you. Here's the thing. I think we're willing to do all of those things if we're familiar with somebody. If we trust them and our experience shows that they're a good person most of the time, maybe they stumbled in their aggression towards us. The problem is, Jesus says anyone, those who intend evil and those who don't, those you know, those who you're unfamiliar with, you get the idea. Everyone, period. I really like the way theologian and pastor C.H. Spurgeon wrote about our inclination as humans. He coined this phrase. He said, good for good is manlike. And he kind of lived in a little bit different era, so this language is a little bit tough for us to grasp, but it's really saying, as humans, when somebody does something good for us, we're willing to do something good back, right? When we're treated with kindness and encouraged, our inclination is to return that kindness and encouragement to those who treat us well. Makes sense. And we should, of course. That part's not hard. This is a learned behavior. As we grow up, we learn that good behavior brings a good return and rewards. That expectation goes with us into life. We learn to return good when someone does good for us, good for good. That's how we're naturally inclined. Spurgeon goes on to say that if humans, if good for good is manlike, then evil for good is devil-like. Now, we all get this correct. No question here. This is the way the enemy of good acts. When he sees those who seek to spread goodness, he plans to discredit and discourage and demean them. We all know we shouldn't act this way. We also learned this from a young age. He's going to hate me for this, but I remember when my son Haven was growing up as a toddler, he reacted to things he didn't want to do by biting people. So we bought a book called Teeth Are Not for Biting, and also a book called Feet Are Not for Kicking and Hands Are Not for Hitting. You get it. We bought the whole set. We didn't want him to grow up thinking that his actions were acceptable, and he figured it out pretty quick, and he liked the books. Understanding evil for good is how the devil operates. That's easy to grasp. And our inclination as humans to return good for good, we get that. But then Spurgeon gives us one last behavior that will help us unpack the challenge behind Jesus' statement. This is what he says. He says, good for evil is godlike. Good for evil is godlike. See, when Jesus teaches in front of the crowd, in front of him, to people who heard him that day, had no idea that the man standing in front of them would soon not only face ridicule and rhetoric from the detractors around him, but torture that no one could stand. People would spit on him and strike both cheeks. They would strip him of his clothes, all of them. And they yelled his name as they chanted, "Crucify him." They did not know that he would endure it, all the while saying these words to God, his Father, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus lived these words on earth until his death on the cross, all the way and all the while experiencing the evil of a broken world who was not kind to him. The challenge was there that day on the mountainside, and it stands for us. The alternative for us is that God gives us what we all deserve. That we face our actions and our decisions and our shortcomings, and that they're met with equally harsh judgment. And I don't say this lightheartedly. If I were to list my sins on a screen here for everybody to see, and then imagine the punishment for those sins, there's just no way I could pay that. There's no way I could withstand that. But I thank God because I don't have to. Jesus paid the price. And because that price was paid and mercy was rendered when I didn't deserve it, The challenge of Jesus' words in this teaching are not a grouping of abstract ideals. They're a journey towards sharing the same mercy with all of those around us, all of those, especially those who we don't want to share it with. If we've all heard it said that the punishment should match the crime, then I need you to lean in one more time. Jesus said we should take a higher path and strive for a different level of love, because love does not retaliate. Love does not return evil for evil. Remember what Paul wrote again. I'm going to put it back up here. Make sure that nobody pays back wrong for wrong, but always strive to do what is good for each other and for everyone else. Do good for each other, all the people who you love and are around you, your family, your church. Of course we want to do good for them. And everyone else. Everyone. We shouldn't just decide that we're free and clear because we don't act in the fashion of the devil, spreading evil around us and spreading hurt, or champion that being good to those who are good to us only. We should do good for everyone because that's what God did for us. It reminds me of a story. It happened early on in our country's history. It involves two men, a landowner named William Ladd and his neighbor, a farmer named Pulsifer, and a large pasture of sheep that belonged to Pulsifer. Pulsifer seemed indifferent to the fact that his sheep would get through his fence and break it down, and they would get into his neighbor's grain yard. Tired of the destruction and the sheep herder's lack of remorse, Ladd ordered his field hands to turn the dogs on the sheep, and if they didn't retreat, to kill them. As his men rode off to carry out his orders, Ladd had a change of heart. He mounted his horse and he rode as hard as he could to cut his men off, and decided that he would go to his neighbor one more time. When Ladd arrived at the fence, he called out to the farmer, but Pulsifer refused to answer. Again, he inquired, "Sir, can I talk to you about the sheep?" Pulsifer was enraged and yelled back, "I heard that you ordered to kill my sheep, and you, a rich man, killing a poor farmer's sheep." And he cursed and yelled at Ladd. After a brief pause, Ladd apologized. "I shouldn't have made that order. But I cannot have the sheep eat all of my grain, and it seems they like my land. So I'm going to move them to my reserve field with my herd and make sure that they're protected there for the entire season. And if any one of your sheep, sir, goes missing in my care, you'll have the choice of my herd." When the farmer heard Ladd's proposal, he said, "My sheep will never bother you again. You talked about shooting my property, and I can shoot back as well. But when you talk with this kind of kindness, I too can be kind. All's well that ends well," we might say. In Mr. Ladd's case, it did. He was within his rights to kill the sheep. He gave the order, but he didn't follow through. He decided peace was a start, and then personal sacrifice could win the day. It did for him, but it doesn't always work that way for us. In our world, retaliation seems to breed retaliation, and often those conflicts spiral until no one remembers the first act of retribution. Wars have started that way. They continue to start that way today, and in the end, both sides lose. And there have been plenty of times that I've tried to be kind to someone who's not kind to me. Maybe you've experienced that as well. Our world is full of hurting people, people who hurt people, and yes, even those who intend to do bad things. But Jesus gave the ultimate goodness and mercy for them as well, all of them. So his words in this teaching can't just be breezed over or highlighted in our Bibles as a reminder. They should be imprinted on our hearts so that we can aspire to be more like him. Love does not retaliate, even if it's our right to do so. Where we fall short, Jesus did not. And when we could not save ourselves, he did. When we should have faced the punishment of our actions, he pardoned us. And his grace did not end that day on the cross. It's always available to those who ask for it and learn from it and strive for a better and right way of living. Our job, our mission is to extend that grace, not just to the brokenhearted, but to the hard-hearted. To look past our rights and our comforts and our preferences, giving ourselves up to show the world a better way, the way. And in doing so, we could open up the doors to an eternity-altering journey, not just for some, but for everyone.
What if our actions and our responses to those around us could change their eternity? Well, they can if we lean into this very hard teaching from Jesus. Hurting people hurt people. Turning the other cheek isn't about taking more abuse. It's about us showing love to those who seemingly don't deserve it. It's not easy. Jesus told us and showed us that it wouldn't be. But it is life-changing. So let's show the world what God looks like. We know that they already know what humanity looks like and what evil looks like. But you get to show them what God looks like. Good for evil is godlike. Live that out this week and give someone a glimpse of who God is. In this week's follow-up video, Pastor Bryan addresses some common questions about turning the other cheek. So check that out and don't miss a week of this series about the Sermon on the Mount. Now, let me know if there's anything that I can do for you this week. You can contact me at mark.tapscott@pccwired.net. Come back next week and invite a friend to join you. We'll see you then.